Right now, your brain is physically changing. And if you've spent significant time alone lately, working from home, scrolling instead of socializing, or just existing in our increasingly isolated world, your brain might be shrinking, literally. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to show you what happens inside your head when human connection disappears, and why scientists are calling social isolation as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. This isn't about feeling lonely. This is about what's happening to your neurons right now. I'm going to take you inside the latest neuroscience research. Studies involving over 600,000 people, brain scans from pandemic lockdowns, and even experiments on astronauts in Antarctica. We're talking about real structural changes, neurotransmitter chaos, and cognitive decline that can start in just weeks. But here's the thing. Some of this is reversible, and understanding exactly what's happening is the first step to protecting your brain. We'll break this down into 7 parts. The structural damage, the chemical disruption, why your memory starts failing, what happens to children versus adults, whether you can recover, and the one surprising intervention that actually works. Let's start with what shocked researchers the most. So picture this. Scientists at Johns Hopkins scanned the brains of 5,000 older adults. 9 years later, they check who developed dementia. The results? People who were socially isolated had 27% higher dementia risk. But when they looked at the brain scans, they found something even more disturbing. The brains were actually smaller. Your hippocampus, that's your memory control center, the part that helps you remember where you put your keys or what you had for breakfast, it physically shrinks when you're isolated, and we're not talking microscopic changes. One study found total brain volume dropped from 67.8% to 67.3% in people with the lowest social contact. That might sound like nothing, but in brain terms, that's massive. And it gets weirder. Your prefrontal cortex, the part that makes you, well, you, the part that controls decision-making, emotional regulation, all that executive function stuff, researchers found significant loss of both gray matter and white matter. Think of gray matter as your brain's processors, and white matter as the cables connecting them. Social isolation damages both. It's like having a slower computer with frayed wires. But here's where it gets really strange. What do you think happened to the amygdala, your brain's fear and emotion center? It got bigger. COVID-19 gave researchers an unplanned global experiment. After lockdowns, brain scans showed people's amygdalas had actually increased in volume. Your brain was literally becoming more wired for fear and emotional reactivity while simultaneously losing its memory and reasoning capacity. One researcher put it this way: your brain is renovating itself for a world that doesn't exist anymore, preparing for threats that never come while letting your social skills rust away. So what's causing all this structural damage? That brings us to your brain chemistry. All right, so your brain is physically changing shape. But why? What's the mechanism? The answer is fascinating and kind of disturbing. Your brain starts acting like you're starving. You know that feeling when you haven't eaten all day and suddenly you can't think about anything except food? That brain state? That's what happens with social isolation, except you're starving for connection. Here's what happens. Specific neurons in your midbrain, the ones that release dopamine, become hyperactive. MIT researchers found that acute social isolation triggers the exact same brain regions as hunger. Your brain literally craves social interaction the way it craves a burger when you're hungry. But, and this is crucial, it's not producing dopamine because you're having social contact. It's producing it because you're not. Your brain is trying to motivate you to seek people out. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism. For most of human history, being isolated meant you were probably going to die, so your brain goes into overdrive, releasing dopamine to make you desperate for connection. Remember how I mentioned your prefrontal cortex shrinking? Well, that same region is also being flooded with oxidative stress, basically rust forming on your neurons. Studies on isolated animals showed the prefrontal cortex was more vulnerable to this damage than other brain areas. Then there's serotonin, your so-called happiness chemical. Social isolation doesn't just reduce it, it creates a chaotic pattern where some brain regions have too much, others too little prairie voles, these monogamous rodents that researchers love because they pair bond like humans. When isolated, they show elevated serotonin in the hypothalamus, but potentially decreased levels in the frontal cortex. What does this actually feel like for you? Depression, anxiety, that weird, restless feeling where you can't focus, emotional volatility where small things set you off. Your brain's chemical messaging system is essentially misfiring, sending contradictory signals about motivation, reward, fear, and pleasure. And this chemical chaos, it's already affecting something you probably noticed but couldn't explain. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, you need to understand what this means for your HPA axis. The HPA axis, don't worry about the acronym, it's basically your stress response system. Social isolation breaks the feedback loop that tells your body to stop releasing stress hormones. It's like your smoke alarm going off and never turning off, even after the fire's out. So now we've got structural brain damage, chemical chaos, and a stress system that won't shut off. What does this actually do to your day-to-day life? Let's talk about something you might be experiencing right now. You walk into a room and forget why you're there. Someone tells you their name, and 30 seconds later, it's gone. You watch a show, and the next day you can barely remember the plot. You probably blamed Netflix fatigue or getting older. But what if I told you that social isolation is literally degrading your cognitive function? A 2024 meta-analysis of over 600,000 people found that loneliness increased dementia risk at the same magnitude as physical inactivity or smoking. Let me repeat that. The same as smoking. It increased Alzheimer's risk by 14%, vascular dementia by 17%, and general cognitive impairment by 12%. But here's what's interesting. Researchers found a distinction between social isolation, actually being alone, and loneliness, feeling alone. When they controlled for genetic dementia risk, social isolation was the bigger predictor. You could feel fine, have great friends online, but if you're not having regular in-person interaction, your brain is still deteriorating. Here's the mechanism. Social interaction is cognitively demanding. You're processing facial expressions, interpreting tone, predicting responses, suppressing inappropriate reactions, retrieving relevant memories, all simultaneously. It's like a full brain workout. When you stop doing that, your brain loses what scientists call cognitive reserve. Basically, your brain's resilience against damage. It's like never exercising and then wondering why you're out of breath climbing stairs. But age matters here. What happens to a 30-year-old's brain versus a 70-year-old's? And what about children? That's where things get really concerning. Okay, this part is genuinely disturbing. You know how everyone says kids are resilient? When it comes to social isolation, that's dangerously wrong. Your brain has critical periods, windows of time where certain neural connections either form or they don't. Miss the window, and you might never get it back. Researchers isolated young mice for just 2 weeks during a specific developmental period, roughly equivalent to childhood in humans. When they tried to reverse the damage by re-socializing them, it didn't work. The myelin, that insulation around your brain's wiring, it never fully recovered. These mice had permanently altered social abilities. Now think about the pandemic. Millions of kids spent critical developmental years behind screens instead of playgrounds. We don't know the full impact yet, but early studies show decreased white matter integrity in children who experienced early social isolation, particularly in pathways connecting the frontal and temporal lobes, where thinking and memories are processed. But here's the nuance, and this is actually good news for adults. If intervention happens early in childhood, the brain can still compensate. Studies on orphans adopted before age 5 showed significant recovery in white matter volume years later. So if you're a parent watching this and panicking about lockdown damage, early intervention matters. Get kids back into real social environments now. The original research on this came from controversial experiments in the 1960s. Monkeys raised in total isolation couldn't form social attachments in adolescence or adulthood. The damage was permanent. The degree of social harm directly correlated with the duration of isolation. Remember that hippocampus shrinkage we talked about? In young brains, that damage can set the stage for cognitive problems decades later. Your brain is literally building the foundation for your entire cognitive future during childhood and adolescence. So here's the answer you've been waiting for. Yes? but with asterisks. Let's start with one of the most extreme examples, Antarctic researchers. 9 people spent 14 months in the Neumayer 3 station, enduring temperatures of minus 50 degrees Celsius with essentially zero outside contact. By the time they emerged, their brains showed significant structural changes, particularly in the dentate gyrus, part of your memory system. But 6 months after returning to normal life, most of the changes reversed. This pattern showed up repeatedly in COVID studies. Those amygdala volume increases reduced as time passed after lockdown. The anxiety-driven brain restructuring started undoing itself once people reconnected. Animal studies back this up. Mice kept in isolation for a week lost the ability to recognize familiar mice, but returned them to their colonies, and within days, their recognition abilities restored. Even the HPA axis, that broken stress response system, it normalized with re-socialization. But, and this is crucial, timing matters. If you're isolated during critical developmental periods, especially in childhood or adolescence, some changes might be permanent. That myelin damage in young mice we talked about? Irreversible. So what does this mean for you right now? If you're an adult who's been isolated, whether from pandemic life, remote work, or just modern existence, your brain has remarkable healing capacity, but the damage accumulates. Every week of continued isolation makes recovery harder. One study on astronauts found that 6-month missions caused structural brain changes, and concerningly, not all of them fully reversed. The longer the isolation, the more persistent the damage. Think of it like physical fitness. If you stop exercising for a month, you lose conditioning. Stop for a year, you lose more. Stop for 5 years? Recovery takes much longer, and you might never get back to baseline. Your social brain works the same way. But here's the surprising part. Not all social contact is equal. There's one type of intervention that consistently works better than others, and it's probably not what you think. So researchers tested everything: video calls, phone conversations, texting, social media, group activities, one-on-one meetups. Want to guess what worked best? It's not what Silicon Valley wants to hear. In-person, face-to-face interaction with actual physical presence was consistently the most effective intervention. And it wasn't even close. Now, here's the nuance. Technology did help. Studies found that older adults with access to phones, email, and computers had 31% lower risk for social isolation than those without video calls or better than nothing. But they're not a replacement. Think about it from your brain's perspective. In-person interaction gives you everything: facial microexpressions, body language, pheromones, spatial positioning, energy, subtle social cues that happen in milliseconds. Your brain evolved over millions of years to process this rich, multisensory social data. When you reduce it to a flat screen, you're giving your brain fast food when it needs a full meal. And here's something researchers consistently found. Quality matters more than quantity. You don't need to be surrounded by hundreds of people. Small, meaningful interactions, conversations where you're actively listening and communicating, exercising those mental skills, those provide the brain workout you need. One study specifically looked at what type of social engagement helps. The answer? Activities that maintain conversation. Things that require you to actively listen, interpret, respond, remember context. Book clubs, board game nights, volunteer work, team sports, cooking together, walking meetings. Anything where you're dynamically engaging with another human brain in real time. But there's one more thing we need to address. Because even if you start reconnecting today, there's a deeper question about what this all means for how we're structuring modern society. Okay, let's zoom out for a minute. We've talked about shrinking hippocampuses, dopamine chaos, memory loss, all the individual brain changes. But there's a bigger, more unsettling pattern here. We're running a massive, unplanned experiment on human neurobiology, and we're only just starting to see the results. Think about it. For most of human history, you were physically surrounded by your tribe, your family, your community. Then came industrialization, nuclear families. suburban isolation, and now, remote work. Social media replacing real interaction, delivery apps so you never have to see a person. The average person now spends more time interacting with screens than humans. We've essentially restructured society in a way that's fundamentally incompatible with how our brains work. Your brain evolved over 300,000 years to operate in small, tight-knit groups with constant face-to-face contact. Modern life happened in the last 200 years. Your biology hasn't caught up. So all those changes we discussed, the structural damage, the chemical disruption, the memory problems, the anxiety, they're not bugs. They're your brain's alarm system screaming that something is fundamentally wrong with how you're living. And here's the scary part. We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The generation that grew up with smartphones and pandemic lockdowns? We won't know their full cognitive outcomes for decades. The elderly aging alone in our increasingly disconnected society? They're showing dementia rates that correlate directly with isolation levels. Researchers are now calling social isolation a public health crisis on par with smoking and obesity. Some estimate it contributes to more early deaths than either. But, and this is important, it's also one of the most modifiable risk factors. Unlike genetics or many diseases, this is something we can actually change, as individuals and as a society. Some places are already doing it, designing cities with community spaces, creating intergenerational living arrangements, building co-working communities, prioritizing third places, those spots between home and work where organic social interaction happens. But it starts with you understanding what's at stake. Your brain isn't designed for this level of isolation. Every day you spend primarily alone or primarily behind screens, you're accumulating damage, slowly, invisibly, but measurably. The good news? You can start reversing it today, right now, one real conversation at a time. So, let's recap what we've learned. Social isolation physically shrinks your hippocampus and prefrontal cortex while enlarging your amygdala. Less memory and reasoning, more fear and anxiety. It throws your neurotransmitters into chaos, creating a brain state similar to starvation. It increases your dementia risk by up to 60%, affecting over 600,000 people in recent studies. Children face potentially irreversible damage during critical developmental periods, but adults can recover if they act soon enough. And the solution isn't complicated, real, face-to-face human connection. Look, I get it. Modern life is exhausting. It's easier to text than meet up. It's more comfortable to stay home. Social media feels like connection, but your brain knows the difference. And it's trying to tell you. Here's what I want you to do. After watching this, think about the last meaningful, in-person conversation you had. When was it? Who was it with? If you can't remember, or if it's been more than a week, that's your sign. Before this weekend's, have one real conversation. Not Zoom, not texting, in person, with someone you care about, or even a stranger at a coffee shop. Your hippocampus will thank you. Your amygdala will calm down. Your prefrontal cortex will start rebuilding. Because here's the ultimate irony. We have more ways to connect than ever in human history, yet we're more isolated than we've ever been. Your brain was built for connection. Every neuron, every chemical pathway, every structural element evolved to make you a social creature. Don't fight 300,000 years of evolution. The science is clear. Your brain needs other brains. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. Share this video with someone you haven't talked to in a while. Comment. When's the last time you had a real conversation? Subscribe for more neuroscience that actually affects your daily life.